Shocking. Minister, this question involves the gap in any legislative protection for seasonal migrant workers, and I am of course aware that this responsibility is not solely yours. There is a role for the Minister for Agriculture and indeed the Minister for Employment Affairs, but we are talking about incredibly vulnerable workers on short-term contracts who come into this country. I'm aware from previous questions, for example, that some of the recruitment agencies operating outside the state are exempt from regulations that are here. So what are our intentions in that regard?
Observing the time, Minister Breen has 2 minutes.
I thank Deputy Daly for the question. Employment rights, as you rightly pointed out, Deputy Daly, is the matter for my colleague, the Minister for Employment Affairs and Social Protection, Regina Doherty. And of course, Ireland is a very thorough employment rights framework. All migrant workers in the state, including those here on a temporary basis, are afforded under the employment rights legislation the same employment rights as Irish citizens. Migrant workers in the European Union and the European Economic Area do not require an employment permit to work in Ireland. My department has a policy responsibility for the Employment Permit Acts and administers the granting of employment permits to non-EEA nationals to work in the state. Under the Employment Permits Act, additional protections for non-EEA workers include minimum annual remuneration levels. The original employment permit is issued to the employee. Information on the employment rights are on the reverse of the employment permit. That's quite clear. There is currently, as the Deputy has pointed out, no seasonal employment permit for non-EEA workers. The review, which was published in September last year, sets out 7 overarching guiding principles that provide for a clear framework for the state's employment permit system. Specifically, it provides for a system with the flexibilities required to ensure that it remains supportive of the Irish labour market at all stages of the economic cycle. The review recommended the introduction of seasonal employment permit, and my department is currently assessing the options for introducing a permit guided by the best international practice. If introduced and in line with the current practice, seasonal non-WEA workers will be covered by employment rights legislation in the same way as other workers. The WRC's, the Workplace Relations Commission's investigation and enforcement power also apply and work to discourage abuses of the employment permit system. So I expect something about that on a temporary basis.
1 minute, Deputy Daly.
I actually believe that this area is a time bomb. I think over the course of the next period there will be explosive revelations in relation to the mistreatment of seasonal migrant workers, and that is a consequence of, in fact, the lack of regulation that exists. These workers are often very vulnerable. The types of issues that have been highlighted involve not exclusively but the use of unregulated agencies, improper and possibly unlawful charges and levies being applied to the workers concerned by employers or agencies acting outside of this jurisdiction, workers being enticed from their families and homes based on earnings and contracts, expectations which are not fulfilled when they get here, and apparent collusion between agencies such as banks, medical providers, accommodation providers and even state services in relation to the provision of national insurance numbers and the inoperability of the JLC for agricultural workers in any meaningful way. These are critically serious issues where there is a legislative gap and they need to be attended to, and I'm a little bit concerned about the Minister's belief that everything is okay. Everything is not okay, and I'm sure there are many members of this House who know what happened in jurisdictions across the water where it took enormous tragedy before action was taken. It's not dissimilar here.
I was about to say that it was complimenting you for observing the time, but I won't. Minister.
Okay. You have to give her leeway after you're missing out. Can I just say too, I suppose traditionally, Deputy Daly, seasonal workers are mainly involved in labour-intensive sections like horticulture and hospitality and tourism. And traditionally as well, if you look at statistics, they have come from EU states, and then they do not require a permit. But as rightly pointed out, there is an issue here in relation to non-WEA workers. And and there is a demand for seasonal workers, as you rightly pointed out, and as the department has seen for itself at first hand. And that's why we're hopefully putting into place interim measures to see what we can do within the, I think it's important to point out this, to see what we can do within the existing regulations that are out there. On a longer term, Deputy Daly, we will need new employment permits legislation to deal with that, and I think the department will deal with that. But we will deal with it, try to deal with it under the existing legislation, and I think that's important to point out.
Final question.
You know, the problem here is there is a regular flow of migrant workers, particularly, say, in the agri-food sector, who, for example, are tied into accommodation agreements, which they've no choice but to enter into, and then find them stuck in bad accommodation with money being deducted from their wages and no questions or answers, no way to question the legality of these arrangements. There are very serious issues around the enforcement of regulations because, and the Minister has indicated this to me previously, while agencies registered in Ireland are not permitted to charge employees for a recruitment fee, those operating outside the state can and do use these instances. And I will remind the Minister that it took a huge tragedy in the UK when 21 migrant workers died in Morecambe Bay before their law was changed, and we do need to urgently look at these situations. We're dealing with people coming from, in many instances, deprived backgrounds with low standards of education, low standards of English-speaking skills and so on, and it does need urgent attention.
Mr. Breen, 1 minute.
Last young Carl, I suppose if you look at my own department and you look at the employment permits that we issue for non-WEA nationals who work in the state, under the Employment Permits as an Act, as I said, you know, they have protection in that minimum annual remuneration levels, and in all permits issued to the employee, information on their employment rights is on the reverse side of that. But I do acknowledge the issue that you have rightly pointed out and the example in the UK, and that we are working on having these seasonal rights for workers that come here, as I said, particularly those from the non-WEA workers, trying to deal with that under the current legislation. And on the longer term, obviously this is the legislation you have an interest in, we will ensure that we have a full legislation in place for seasonal workers, given the high demand for the out there.
The next question, Deputy Pat.